11 years ago, if you'd have said, well, there'll be a big cartoon crisis in Europe in the coming years, people would say, what? It's like a Mickey Mouse atrocity, or a Bugs Bunny outrage. It's surreal, but it's what Salman Rushdie said after the Satanic Verses affair. He said, I felt like I'd fallen through the looking glass, and I didn't know if I'd ever get back. We've all fallen through that looking glass. We have come to a situation, as people have said about the Satanic Verses affair, where we've internalized the fatwa. As societies, we've internalized this, and this is one of the things which I think we've learned most clearly from the last 10 years. We've internalized the, absurd to use a phrase still, Mohammed cartoon crisis. But we have learned some things in the last 10 years, and I'll dwell on them for a moment. We've learned, in as clear a way as could possibly have been learned by anybody, that most of the press in free Western countries are cowards. We've learned that most of our artistic establishment are cowards, and that most of our politicians are cowards. We've learned that industries that spend much of their year in awards ceremonies patting themselves and each other on the back for their bravery stop when an actual act of bravery may be required. We have watched as the entire liberal class of artists and writers and thinkers stop just at the point where bravery is needed. We've learned, once again, for the first time in some centuries in Europe, about blasphemy. Again, if 20 years ago you'd have said the early years of the 21st century in Europe will be dominated by a discussion of blasphemy, people would have said, what? You don't mean repeal of blasphemy laws. You mean, no, actually the discussion about blasphemy. Probably the next thing people would have said was, when did the Spanish Inquisition get back into Europe? How did that happen? No, this is a different type of blasphemy we're talking about. Nobody would have believed you. They'd have thought all of your critical faculties were off, all your prediction mechanisms had gone awry. But that's what the 21st century, not just in Europe, but in a lot of Western countries, is dominated by. Often it's a subterranean conversation. Often it goes above that level. Canada, once again, is debating more blasphemy laws. Mark Stein knows this better than anybody by personal experience, but just recently there is another attempt to impose effectively blasphemy laws in Canada. Of course, it's said that this will only have tried to scoop up the most extreme speech and so on, but no. Already the self-appointed censors in Canada are saying that they're looking forward to prosecuting people who engage in so-called hate speech about Islam. We learned a lot of other things. We learned that our politicians are incredibly good at dealing with secondary problems. Let me give you a couple of examples. Whenever anything has happened in Europe of any popular attempt to register discontent about the weakness of our political elites, the politicians have been incredibly good at coming down on that secondary reaction. So in the UK, when somebody called Tommy Robinson started a movement called the English Defence League, I didn't agree with it, I didn't like what it did, but he started this. It was a movement, a street protest movement. When he started that, very soon afterwards, his own house was raided by police, his family's houses were raided by police, computers were taken away, and they managed to get him to prison on a mortgage fraud case. They sifted through everything in him, in his background, everything in his life, everything in his family's life. They found something, he went to prison. Mortgage fraud is bad, don't get me wrong. But it seemed rather obvious to some of us that the reason he was in prison was not because of the mortgage fraud, but because he was a problem, and people, particularly our politicians, wanted that problem to go away. My point about this is, Tommy Robinson, the EDL, was a secondary symptom of a problem. They were the result of politicians rightly being seen not to have done anything with the primary problem. And the question some of us have kept on asking is, if you could do that with that person who caused you a problem, why couldn't you do it with the people that person was objecting to? Why couldn't you send the police into the houses of every extreme Islamist mullah in Britain, every radical preacher in Britain? I can bet some of them have got some dodgy mortgage stuff on the books. I can bet you'll get some of them on a technicality to do with something they've done once. But that's not the aim. The aim is to go to the secondary problem. Another example, Chancellor Merkel in her New Year message on the Pegida protests. I don't agree with the Pegida protests particularly. That's not the point. It is a legitimate movement of people saying that they dislike some of the things that are happening in their country. But that is not... their primary concern was not what Angela Merkel was concerned about. She and the entire administration of her government turns on the reaction to the problem. So in her New Year's message, she says that the Pegida protesters have coldness in their hearts. Why does she not say the Islamists who the Pegida protesters are concerned about have the most incredible coldness in their hearts? That is our primary problem. We must be careful as Germans not to have too much coldness in our own hearts, but that is the problem. No, we have a political class that believes that you can solve these problems by dealing with the secondary symptoms. It is like going to a body racked with disease and solving a skin inflammation. This is a magnificent problem of our time, the inability to grapple with the primary problem. We've learned other things, though, of course. We learned in January this year that absolutely everybody seemed to be Charlie. We learned that Mahmoud Abbas was Charlie. We learned that every politician who has spent the last 10 years calling cartoonists inflammatory and Islamophobic and right-wing and fundamentalists and Enlightenment fundamentalists and troublemakers and so on, was Charlie for about an hour. Because we learned very soon after that almost nobody was Charlie. We learned in the end, sadly, that even Charlie wasn't Charlie when earlier this year, perfectly understandably, surviving members of the staff of Charlie Hebdo said they didn't want to keep drawing Mohammed. The British principle of freedom of speech was always that it's not a right, it's not something you are born with and it comes from nowhere. It's a necessity, and it's a necessity to keep a society free. Because the reason why free speech in the British tradition came about, through Milton, Mill and others, was that you had to hear dissident voices, you had to hear contrary opinions, because only if you could hear those opinions and allowed yourself to hear them and to read them and to see them and to view them, could you first of all work out if you yourself were in error. If you were in error, it would strengthen the truth which you held by hearing a contrary opinion. But also, it was possible, and it remains possible today, that contrary opinion, that minority opinion against the overwhelming consensus of your time, might turn out to be right. And if it does turn out to be right, you should not disable yourself from being able to hear it, from being able to read it, from being able to see it. That's why freedom of speech matters. It's because it's the only way we have to avoid error. And that is why what has happened in the last 10 years and the intimidation and the attempt to shut debate down by people who come in through the front door with Kalashnikovs and cowardly, cringing officials and others who come through the back door with legislation and so on, are so much part of this problem. Because we need to hear this contrary opinion, because it may just be the case, and I submit to you that it is, that what has been seen to be the contrary opinion in recent years was the opinion that was right, which is that there is a problem, and something about which we should be concerned, and which is going on in our society, and that we would like to stop it. Now, in wrapping up, I would just say this. It seems to me that the thing I've certainly learned most in the last 10 years is this. Freedom never was a very popular idea. It's serious. Look back in history, at almost any phase, not just the mid-20th century, which is all anyone seems to know about these days, but almost any period in history. Most people weren't bothered particularly about freedom. They wanted security, and they wanted safety, and they wanted a comfortable and an easy life, and they wanted to be cosy. Freedom of speech was only ever defended by a few people, just as freedom in general was only ever defended by a few people. But maybe it only ever needed a few people. One of the proudest things of my life in recent years has been coming to Denmark, making some very good friends here, of getting to know Lars, Flemming, Hella, and a whole set of other people who are among the few people. There are some in America, some in Canada, one or two in Britain, a few on the continent. But I would say, in wrapping up, that one of the things I think you could be proudest of is that when the history of this era is written, and it will be written, and I'm more optimistic than Henrik, that when it does come to be written, the name of Denmark will be able to be talked about with enormous pride. Thank you. A few years ago at a university in London, some students came to me and said their student newspaper was going to run a cartoon of Mohammed, and I think did. The Student Islamic Society leader said that the names of the editors of this student newspaper had appeared on an Al-Qaeda website. You see. This caused a huge furore among the university and so on. Of course, the thing was withdrawn. But then the Student Islamic Society leader said, to the kids who allegedly have done this, if you apologise, and I can see if I can mediate a bit, sort of thing. That is the thing that is happening all the time. All the time. People with Kalashnikovs don't have to be very large in number, because behind them they have a whole group of people who find it very useful that they have people with Kalashnikovs on their side. And you can go a long way if you can say, basically, I'm not getting the old, mob trick. You turn up at somebody's door with a huge bouncer in black glasses and you say, well, I'm not going to hurt you, but my mate, he's mad as hell at you. It's incredibly effective. And in the end, by the way, before the last question, in the end, that will catch, because other people will get that idea. And they'll think, we could do with a few people with Kalashnikovs who just showed some urgency on our side, and think what we could achieve. I've always said I feel sorry as hell for the Sikh community in Britain. They have never had any massive influxes of government funding or so on. And a few years ago, when some Sikh leaders came to me and pointed out, we always get the flack for all the Muslims not integrating and all that sort of thing. What would you recommend? I stress jokingly said, why don't you get 4 guys to blow up the London Underground? Because, as I say, it was a joke, and they did not follow my opinion. This is not hate speech. But you see the point.
Thank you, Douglas Murray, for your great black sense of humour. We make the correct analysis, we use reason, and we are losing. Right now, maybe on turn, but right now we're losing all the way around. I'm really stunned that you tell us that there are only 2 or 3 people like you in Britain. I hope not. But my question to you is, are we there where we must realize that there will be violence? We must be able to defend ourselves. Has the time come to teach our young boys, our young men, that they must be able to use a weapon? And they must be able to stand up for their families.
No, I don't think that's where we are. But I would say this on all this: I wouldn't be so downhearted about, as it were, the situation one is in now. As I say, I'm not either an optimist or a pessimist. I think these things are attitudes. You can wake up one morning feeling optimistic. You can go to a dinner in the evening feeling pessimistic. These things come and go. But one thing I would say is this. The other side have got a hell of a PR problem. And this might just become clearer in the years ahead. Whilst our politicians almost all say, there are obviously notable exceptions, the same thing, the public opinion polls show the public are thinking quite different things. Look at polls in France or Germany about people's views about Islam as a whole. 70% of French people in a recent poll saying that Islam is incompatible with French society. 70%. Now, I would submit that this is one of the most interesting and problematic things going on, that the divide has grown very, very large. Now, I would say that that divide is bridgeable, and it's bridgeable by decent mainstream politicians, as there are some across the continent now, filling that gap. Because let me put it this way, I've said for a long time to politicians in the UK, you have a real problem, because the public can see something very, very clearly. They don't like being blown up, they don't like cartoonists being shot, they don't like young girls being abducted, and so on. They don't like these things. And you, in the meantime, are saying it has nothing to do with this culture or this religion. And I always put it this way when I get a chance to speak to a politician. Let's look a couple of years down the line, and let's pretend that something happened like something that was attempted several times in the last decade. Let's say that an Islamist cell manages to blow up a women's nightclub on, a nightclub on Women's Night. This was tried. There have been people sent to prison for trying this. One in the centre of London 8 years ago. They said, they put the bomb outside the ladies' night on a nightclub and said, who could feel any sympathy for these slags all dancing around? Now look, when that happens, if that happens, God knows, we hope it doesn't, but there are lots of people always trying to do it. When at a northern nightclub on Ladies' Night or something like that, the bomb goes off, and there's dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of maimed young girls, the British Prime Minister cannot come out the next day and say this has nothing to do with Islam, because nobody believes him anymore. And therein lies a massive democratic problem for our countries and a massive problem of legitimacy for our political class. My view is they have to spend the coming years, and they could, changing their position on this, facing up to what is in front of all of us, bridging that gap, and making sure that the response of European societies to this huge problem, when it comes, is a decent response. Thank you.